Lock your doors, draw the blinds, and turn down the lights. Because tonight, we aren't dealing in myths. We aren't dealing in urban legends. Tonight, you're going to listen to a real story. A nightmare that actually happened to a family just like yours. Proceed at your own risk. In the late autumn of 1975, the Lutz family was rapidly outgrowing their life. They lived in a cramped, two-bedroom duplex in Deer Park, New York. George Lutz, a pragmatic and hardworking man of 28, ran his own small land surveying company. He spent his days in heavy boots, trudging through muddy plots of Long Island real estate, measuring property lines, and drawing up topographical maps. His evenings were spent hunched over a drafting table in their tiny living room, trying to build a future for his family. His wife, Kathy, was the anchor of the household. Warm, fiercely protective, and endlessly patient, she balanced keeping the books for George's fledgling surveying business with the full-time job of raising 3 energetic children. The kids, Danny, 10, Chris, 8, and little Missy, just 5 years old, were practically climbing the walls of the duplex. Danny, the oldest, was an active, sports-obsessed boy who constantly accidentally knocked over lamps with rogue baseballs. Chris, the quiet, middle child, was an explorer who needed a backyard rather than narrow concrete driveway. And little Missy, with her bright eyes and boundless imagination, desperately wanted a bedroom of her own instead of sharing a cramped space with her 2 older brothers. Even Harry, their hulking Malamute Labrador mix, seemed depressed by the lack of space, spending his days curled up under the kitchen table with his tail tucked. George and Kathy spent every Sunday morning scouring the real estate, classifieds over black coffee, but their budget was tight. Long Island was expensive, and George's business, while steady, wasn't pulling a mansion. Money. They had a strict ceiling of $80,000, a sum that usually afforded them viewings of rundown fixer-uppers or houses squeezed onto postage stamp lots beside busy highways. Until the second week of November, when George's eyes landed on a tiny, unpictured listing at the bottom of the Newsday property section. Amityville, South Shore. 6-bed, 3.5 bath. Dutch Colonial revival. Waterfront property with boathouse. Must sell immediately. 80,000 firm. It's a misprint, George said, tapping the newspaper with his pen. 6 bedrooms on the water in Amityville for 80,000? They forgot a 1 in front of that number. Call them, Kathy urged, leaning over his shoulder, her heart doing a hopeful flutter. What if it isn't? What if it's just a motivated seller? An hour later, they were crammed into George's work van, the kids buzzing with excitement in the back, following a nervous, excessively sweaty reel estate agent named Caldwell through the affluent, tree-lined streets of Amityville. When they pulled up to 112 Ocean Avenue, the entire family fell dead silent. It was magnificent. The house was a sprawling, 3-story Dutch Colonial revival masterpiece, painted a stark, crisp white with dark shingles. A wide, welcoming front porch wrapped around the ground floor. But the most striking feature was the top floor. 2 large, quarter-moon windows faced the street, looking down over the frost-covered front lawn like a pair of heavy-lidded, unblinking eyes. Beyond the house, the property stretched down to the dark, freezing waters of the Amityville River, complete with a massive wooden boathouse and a privat dock. Mr. Caldwell, George said slowly, stepping out of the van and staring up at the grand estate. As a land surveyor, he knew property values. He knew the land alone was worth more than the asking price. What's the catch? Is the foundation cracked? Is it sinking into the river? No, nothing like that, Mr. Lutz, Caldwell said quickly, refusing to meet George's eyes. The agent nervously wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Despite the biting winter cold, the bones are excellent, perfect condition. Then why is it $80,000? Kathy asked, holding Missy's hand. tightly as they walked up the paved driveway. Caldwell cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at the house. The previous owners, well, they ran into severe financial ruin. It was a very sudden, tragic bankruptcy. The bank took possession and they just wanted off their ledgers before the end of the fiscal year. They priced it for a one-day sale. If you don't take it today, someone else will tomorrow. It was a lie of omission so massive it bordered on criminal, but Caldwell's agency had strictly instructed him not to mention the DeFeo family massacre unless directly asked. 13 months ago, a young man had systematically executed his parents and 4 siblings in their sleep within those very walls. The blood had soaked so deeply into the floorboards that the bank had been forced to replace the carpets and repaint every room. But George and Kathy Lutz didn't know that. They didn't read the tabloids. They lived 3 towns over, and the name DeFeo meant absolutely nothing to them. All they saw was a miracle. Inside, the house was a palace. Danny and Chris immediately sprinted up the grand wooden staircase, their footsteps echoing through the massive, empty halls, calling out dibs on the largest bedrooms. Kathy wandered into the kitchen, running her hands over the pristine countertops, tears of joy welling in her eyes. There was a formal dining room, a massive living room, with a stone fireplace, a sewing room, and a fully finished basement. George walked the perimeter of the rooms, tapping the walls, checking the pipes, looking for the fatal flaw that explained the price tag. He found none. The house felt strangely cold, and the air carried a faint, unidentifiable, musty odor, but he chalked it up to the property sitting empty through the winter months. Standing in the master bedroom, looking out over the sprawling backyard and the dark river, George pulled Kathy into his arms. "Can we really do this?" Kathy whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud, lest the illusion shatter. "Is it really ours?" George smiled, feeling a surge of pride. He was finally going to give his family the home they deserved. "I'll write the check for the deposit right now. We'll close by December." Downstairs, Mr. Caldwell happily took George's check, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the heavy brass keys. The agent couldn't get out of the house fast enough, practically running to his car. Standing on the front porch of 112 Ocean Avenue, watching the agent speed away, George and Kathy Lutz put their arms around each other. The kids were laughing inside, playing hide and seek in the sprawling corridors. It was the happiest day of their lives. They had found their forever home. They had absolutely no idea that they had just purchased a slaughterhouse. Moving day was a blur of cardboard boxes, heavy lifting, and sheer, intoxicating excitement. On December 18th, 1975, the Lutz family officially took possession of 112 Ocean Avenue. For the first 2 weeks, the house was everything they had dreamed of and more. The kids treated the sprawling estate like their own personal amusement park. Danny and Chris spent their afternoons exploring the boathouse and racing up and down the grand staircase, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Little Missy finally had her own room, a beautiful, sunlit space on the second floor overlooking the backyard. Kathy spent her days arranging furniture and planning a massive garden for the spring, while George proudly walked the property lines, still marveling at the fact that this incredible piece of real estate was actually his. They set up a tall, glorious Christmas tree in the living room, its colorful lights reflecting in the dark wood of the floorboards. It felt like the beginning of a perfect, idyllic chapter in their lives. But houses, like people, have moods, and as the calendar turned over to January, approaching their 20th day in the home, the mood of 112 Ocean Avenue began to shift. It started so subtly that it was easy to dismiss. The first thing they noticed was the cold. It was a particularly bitter winter on Long Island, but the chill inside the house felt different. It wasn't the ambient draft of old windows. It felt targeted, like stepping into an invisible column of ice. No matter how high George cranked the newly inspected thermostat, the house refused to hold the heat. George, usually a warm-blooded and active man, began spending hours hunched in front of the living room fireplace, constantly throwing heavy logs into the flames, trying to banish a bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate from the very walls. The boiler must be struggling with the square footage, George muttered. One evening, rubbing his hands together as his breath lightly plumed in the living room air, "I'll have a guy come look at it next week." But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the creeping, undeniable feeling that they were no longer alone. Around the 20-day mark, the cracks in their perfect reality began to show. Small, inexplicable things started happening, incidents too bizarre to ignore, yet not quite terrifying enough to send them packing. It started with George. One night, he awoke with a sudden, violent gasp, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs as if he had just been electrocuted. He felt an intense, irrational surge of panic, a heavy pressure pressing down on his chest. He rolled over, covered in a cold sweat, and looked at the glowing red numerals of the digital alarm clock on the nightstand. It read 3:15 a.m. He got up, walked the halls, checked the locks, and stared out at the freezing river, finding nothing. He chalked it up to stress. But the next night, his eyes snapped open again. The panic was the same. The heavy pressure was the same. He looked at the clock. 3:15 a.m. It became a nightly ritual. Every single night, at the exact same minute, George was jolted awake. He didn't know that 3:15 a.m. was the estimated time Ronald DeFeo Jr. had moved from room to room with his rifle 13. Months prior, George only knew that the lack of sleep was making him irritable, sluggish, and uncharacteristically quick-tempered with the kids. Kathy was experiencing her own quiet torment. While George was plagued by the night, Kathy's incidents happened in the broad daylight. She was standing at the kitchen sink one afternoon, washing lunch plates, when she distinctly felt a firm, heavy hand stroke the back of her neck. Assuming it was George, she turned around with a smile. The kitchen was completely empty. Before she could process the shock, the air around her thickened. The distinct, powdery smell of a cheap, old-fashioned floral perfume washed over her. It was so strong she sneezed. But within seconds, the sweet scent soured, rapidly warping into the putrid, stomach-churning stench of raw sewage and rotting meat. Kathy gagged, covering her mouth with a dish towel, and ran into the hallway. When she returned 10 minutes later with an air freshener, the kitchen smelled like lemons and dish soap. The rot was entirely gone. Harry, their normally brave and boisterous Malamute Labrador mix, was perhaps the most honest barometer of the house's changing atmosphere. The dog, who used to sleep at the foot of the kids' beds, now refused to go upstairs at all. Worse was his reaction to the basement. George had set up a small workbench down there, but Harry flat out refused to follow him. The dog would stand at the top of the basement stairs, the fur on his spine standing rigidly at attention, his teeth bared in a vicious snarl. He would bark frantically at the empty darkness below, occasionally snapping his jaws at thin air, as if trying to bite invisible intruders trying to creep up the steps. But the strangest incident occurred on a Tuesday morning in the second-floor sewing room. Kathy opened the door to put away some folded laundry and stopped dead in her tracks, despite the freezing January temperatures outside weather that guaranteed no insects could survive the large window of the sewing room was completely blackened. It was a thick, chaotic swarm of large, fat blowflies. There were hundreds of them crawling over the glass, their bodies piled on top of one another. The sound of their buzzing wasn't a normal insect hum. It sounded deeper, almost like a room full of people whispering aggressively in hushed tones. Disgusted, Kathy rolled up a magazine and spent 20 minutes squashing them, sweeping their carcasses into a dustpan and throwing them in the trash. She assumed a small animal had died in the walls. But the very next morning, when she checked the room, the window was entirely covered. Again, hundreds more flies had appeared out of nowhere, swarming the freezing glass. The final straw that shifted the house from quirky to deeply unsettling came from 5-year-old Missy. Kathy was walking past Missy's bedroom when she heard her daughter giggling and talking animatedly. Kathy peeked around the doorframe. Missy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a teacup out to empty space. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Kathy asked, forcing a light-hearted tone. "My new friend," Missy said brightly, not taking her eyes off the empty corner of the room. "Jody, is Jody a little girl from school?" Missy finally looked at her mother, her expression turning surprisingly serious. "No, Mommy, Jody isn't a girl. He's an angel, but he looks like a pig. A really, really big pig with glowing red eyes." Missy turned back to the empty corner and smiled. "He says he likes it here. He says he's going to stay with us forever." A cold shudder violently worked its way down Kathy's spine. She looked from her innocent daughter to the empty, chillingly quiet corner of the bedroom. The honeymoon was officially over. The Lutz family was beginning to realize that when they bought 112 Ocean Avenue, they hadn't just bought a house, they had inherited something else. And whatever it was starting to wake up. By the end of their third week in 112 Ocean Avenue, the house was no longer merely unsettling. It was actively consuming the Lutz family. The pervasive cold had settled into their bones, and a heavy, oppressive fog of dread dictated their every waking moment. The entity or entities in the house were no longer content with playing tricks in the shadows. They began to step into the light. The manifestations escalated from phantom smells and sounds to terrifying visual encounters. It began with Kathy. One evening, while folding laundry in the basement, she heard a soft, rhythmic weeping coming from the corner near the boiler. Thinking it was Chris or Danny, she approached the shadows. Instead of her sons, she saw a young woman, perhaps 18 years old, huddled on the concrete floor. The girl was wearing a blood-soaked nightgown. As Kathy gasped, the girl slowly turned her head. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, and a massive, gaping exit wound from a high-powered rifle had obliterated her chest. Before Kathy could scream, the girl dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind the overwhelming stench of copper and sulfur. George was not spared. His 3:15 a.m. awakenings were no longer silent. One night, dragged from sleep at the exact same minute, he heard the distinct, deafening crack of a rifle echoing from down the hall. He leaped out of bed, grabbing a heavy flashlight. As he stepped into the hallway, the temperature plummeted. Standing at the far end of the corridor were two young boys, no older than 10 and 12, staring blankly at him. Their pajamas were soaked in dark, viscous blood. "Help us," one of the boys whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "He's coming back." George squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. When he opened them, the hallway was empty, but the terror had finally broken through his denial. The supernatural siege began to take a severe physical toll, primarily on 5-year-old Missy. The bright, energetic little girl had withered into a pale, lethargic ghost of herself. She developed a high, persistent fever that no pediatrician could explain. Dark, bruised bags formed under her eyes, and she refused to eat. She spent all her time in her room, whispering to the empty corner. "Missy, please eat some soup," Kathy begged one afternoon, kneeling by her daughter's bed. Missy stared blankly at the wall. "Jody says I don't need to eat anymore. Jody says if I go to sleep, I can stay here with him and the other kids. Forever. They're so cold, Mommy. They want me to keep them warm." Kathy burst into tears, terrified, when she tried to physically pick Missy up. To take her to the hospital, the child, suddenly possessed, an unnatural dead. Wait, it felt as if unseen hands were pushing down on the little girl, refusing to let her leave the bed. On the morning of their 28th day in the house, George drove into town to pick up stronger fever medication for Missy. Exhausted, disheveled, and running on sheer adrenaline, he stopped at a local diner for a black coffee. The man behind the counter, an older Amityville local, glanced at George's pale face. "You look like hell, buddy. Where you living?" "Just moved in last month," George muttered, staring into his coffee. 112 Ocean Avenue. The diner went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The man behind the counter stared at George, his eyes wide with a mixture of pity and horror. "Ocean Avenue? You mean the DeFeo place?" "Jesus Christ. Mister, how do you sleep in that slaughterhouse?" George froze. The what? 10 minutes later, George was bursting through the doors of the Amityville Public Library, frantically demanding the local newspaper archives from November 1974. His hands shook violently as he threaded the microfiche into the machine. The headline screamed at him in stark black and white: "Entire family massacred in Amityville home." George read the horrifying details. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had taken a .35 caliber Marlin rifle and systematically murdered his father, his mother, his 2 brothers, and his 2 sisters while they slept in their beds. Then, George's blood ran ice cold as he read the police timeline. The coroner estimated the murders had begun at exactly 3:15 a.m. The phantom gunshots, the ghostly boys in the hallway, the bleeding woman in the basement. They weren't demons, they were the echoes of a butchery that the house had absorbed. And worse, George realized with sickening clarity that the violent rage he had been feeling, the urges to snap at his wife, the anger toward his children, was the exact same demonic influence that had possessed Ronald DeFeo. The house was trying to make him repeat the history. George sped back to the house, his tires squealing on the icy roads. As he pulled into the driveway, he knew instantly that things had escalated to a catastrophic level. The house seemed to pulsate with a dark, suffocating energy. He burst through the front door. "Kathy, get the kids. Now!" The house responded instantly. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind him with the force of a bomb, the deadbolt clicking shut on its own. The temperature inside was sub-zero. A cacophony of horrific sounds filled the air. The Phantom Marching Band played a deafening, discordant tune, accompanied by the agonizing screams of a woman and the booming crack of a rifle. "George!" Kathy screamed from upstairs. George sprinted up the stairs, fighting against a freezing headwind that seemed to blow straight down the corridor. Black, gelatinous slime was now actively weeping from the walls, pooling onto the floorboards. He found Kathy in Missy's room. She was hysterically trying to pull the little girl from the bed, but Missy was screaming, her eyes rolled back in her head. In the corner of the room, 2 massive, glowing red eyes manifested in the shadows. The air smelled of rotting flesh and pig manure. Jody had come to collect. "No!" George roared, driven by a father's pure, desperate instinct. He lunged forward, grabbing Missy in his arms. The unseen weight tried to rip her back, but George fought with every ounce of strength he had, tearing his daughter free from the entity's grasp. "Danny, Chris, let's go!" George bellowed. The 2 boys ran from their rooms, crying in terror. Harry the dog was howling wildly at the bottom of the stairs. They bolted down the staircase as the house literally shook around them. Light bulbs shattered in their sockets, raining glass down on their heads. The walls groaned as if the house were a living beast trying to swallow them whole. George grabbed Harry's collar and kicked the heavy front door. It wouldn't budge. The deadbolt was jammed. "Get away!" George yelled, grabbing a heavy brass umbrella stand from the foyer. With a guttural scream, he swung it like a baseball bat, shattering the glass panels beside the door. He reached through the jagged glass, his forearm slicing open, and wrenched the lock back from the outside. He kicked the door open, and they spilled out onto the freezing snow-covered lawn. The moment they crossed the property line, the deafening screams inside. Their heads stopped. The oppressive, suffocating weight vanished. Missy, shivering in George's arms, opened her eyes, the fever seemingly broken in. An instant, George didn't look back. He threw the kids and the dog into the back of the work van, shoved Kathy into the passenger seat, and jumped behind the wheel. His hand was bleeding, shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life as George threw it into drive and sped away from the curb. Kathy turned to look out the window. 112 Ocean Avenue sat silent and still under the gray winter sky. The twin quarter-moon windows stared out over the lawn, looking like dark, unblinking eyes. The house had claimed everything they owned. Their clothes, their furniture, their savings, it was all left behind in the dark. But they had escaped with their lives. They would never, ever go back.